Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. During previous lectures, we've started to discuss ancient Greek history. We talked about the Bronze Age Greeks, specifically the Minoans on the island of Crete and the Mycenaeans who existed and lived on mainland Greece itself. Ms. Moxery also discussed Greek mythology, which was definitely unique and different from different religions that we've discussed in past lectures. But today's lecture will talk about a Greek city-state called Athens. For the next few lectures, we'll talk about the city-states in Greece, some of the main city-states, I guess you could say, the important players, although there were numerous city-states that made up the island of Greece. Greece was not unified as we know it today. During the time period that we are discussing and lecturing about, Greece was not unified. It was actually divided. Some of these city-states would make alliances with each other to fight maybe a common enemy, which would eventually in a few lectures become Persia, the Persian Empire. And at other times, these city-states would fight against each other, and that was also very common. You've learned about the geography of Greece itself. Greece isn't very big as it is, but it was very mountainous. And so a lot of times, these city-states would develop differently. For example, Athens, the topic that we will discuss today, developed extremely in a very different way than our topic for a future lecture called Sparta. In fact, Athens will be known for developing a democratic style of government, although it's not democracy as we know it in America. In America, we have what's called representative democracy. In other words, you go and you vote for representatives to make the decisions for you in Congress. They're the ones that make the laws and make the decisions and vote. You vote for the representative. Now, Athens democracy develops a little bit differently. It's more of a direct democracy. Majority of people, not everyone obviously will have the right to vote in Athens, but a majority will have the right to vote on different measures. They have a huge assembly that would, 400 or 500 people would be involved in this assembly, this body of government in Athens. So Athens develops into a democracy. Now, Dr. Price, when he discusses Athens, the typical polis, we'll have to find out if he really feels it is a typical polis, typical city-state, polis meaning city-state, or what arguments he has saying that maybe it isn't a typical polis. We'll have to find the answer to that in his upcoming lecture. Now, Athens, of course, is also very powerful in and of itself, and it will have more of a cultural aspect to it. Athens is more focused on the Navy, because it is there right next to water, of course, and that's always prominent when you have an important navy. And Athens is very open to culture and cultural ideas. We'll see that's a big difference from the other city-state, Sparta, that will have its own lecture as well. Sparta is more landlocked. Sparta residing on the Peloponnesus, southern Greece is where that is. And of course, Sparta focusing more on its army, and Sparta being more culturally isolated. So just to give you an example of how totally different these two Greek city-states can be, but yet they are very much living in close proximity to each other. At times they fight together, and at times they fight against each other. So it will be very interesting to find out from Dr. Price a little bit about the development of Athens and how Athens will become so important to not only the United States, but Western civilization as a whole.
Today we're going to take a look at the polis of the Athenians. First, let's take a look at the geography of Athens and the influence that that geography had on the growth of the Athenian state. The territory of the Athenians occupied a rocky peninsula in central Greece called Attica. Attica included very little good farmland. It was generally a poor region, except in the classical period it had a fair quantity of silver that was mined there. The city of Athens itself is about 5 miles from the sea, and so Athens had developed 2 very good harbors within a few miles of the city of Athens to take care of her sea trade. Some scholars believe that when the Athenian Mycenaean city fell in around 1200 BC, it still maintained a fairly high level of civilization as it made a transition into the Bronze Age. It was never really destroyed. Iron Age burials around Athens from the early 900s BC contained very rich, very extensive grave goods that indicate that Athens was involved in trade in both the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean by the 900s BC. So Athens has a little bit of a head start as a Greek city-state in the early period of Iron Age Greece, which is after the Dark Age and what we call the Archaic period. Evidence about the earliest organization of the Athenian polis is pretty limited, but there's enough information to give us some kind of idea about how it developed. Perhaps because the Athenians were not really affected by the Dorian incursions of the 1100s. The Athenian constitution remained relatively backward until as late as 600 BC. In the executive branch of government in the mid-700s, the king was eliminated. The basileus, I talked about that, the position of king last time, was eliminated, and the king was replaced with a committee or board of 9 annually elected officials, 9 annually elected magistrates, and these magistrates were called the archons. In addition to the archons, there was also a council. We'll talk about that in a minute. Each archon was responsible for some aspect of royal administration. There was an archon for war. There was an archon for treasury affairs. There was an archon in charge of the court system, and so forth and so on. Now, the council at Athens, the boule, I believe is the term I used last time, was called the Council of the Areopagus, the Council of the Areopagus. And in the earliest period, this council had considerable powers. The council was made up of former archons. In order to be a council member, you had to have held the office of archon for a year. And these archons, after they got out of office, became permanent lifetime members of the Council of the Areopagus. Now, there was also an assembly of all Athenian citizens who bore arms, who fought for the Athenian state, an assembly of warriors, if you will. And this assembly was called the Ecclesia. It was made up of all adult men who bore arms for the city. Like all ancient assemblies, the Ecclesia represented the Athenian army at peace. The assembly elected officials and made important decisions on matters of policy that were handed down to it by the Council of the Areopagus. This early ecclesia was not a deliberative body. That is, it wasn't able to debate or discuss policy. Its only function was to vote yes or no to these policies that were handed down from the council. If the majority voted yes, the policy was carried. If the majority voted no, the policy died. It had no debating powers. That was the job of the council. Now, participation in this early government of Athens was limited in two important ways. Of course, women were not allowed to participate, slaves were not allowed to participate, but it was also limited in two other important ways. First off, the rapid expansion of Athenian trade in the 700s BC had prompted a fairly large number of merchants and traders to move to Athens. It was where the business was good. So an awful lot of folks moved to Athens from other parts of Greece and other parts of the Aegean. And these folks were called metics, M-E-T-I-C-S, metics, and they were not citizens. They had no role in government at all, even though they might be quite substantial residents in terms of their wealth. They still took no part in government, and of course they took no part in the army either. But even among the citizen body itself, even among those who were born Athenian citizens, all citizens could vote in the assembly, but only members of the aristocratic families, only members of the aristoi, we called them last time, could actually hold the archonship, which of course meant that only aristocrats could be members of the council. Now, these aristocratic families were called the eupatridae, and the word means literally the offspring of noble fathers. So this was an aristocracy that was in the blood. In other words, in order to be a eupatridae, a member of the eupatrid class, your father had to be a member of that class as well. It was a hereditary nobility. Now, the eupatridae would dominate politics because only they could hold the archonship, which meant only they could sit on the council, and since the council made policy, only the aristocrats had the power to make policy for the Athenian state. Well, how did they become a different group, an aristocratic group within Athens? They derived their wealth from agriculture. They had the largest farms. Before 600 BC, most people in the region were still small farmers, and the limited farmland that was available in Attica made it very difficult for these small farmers to make a living. Between 750 and 600 BC, the population of Attica gradually increased. As it did, it became more and more difficult for small farmers to grow enough food to support their families. In bad years, these small farms would have to borrow food from their richer neighbors in order to survive and in order to have enough seed to grow to plant for the next season. Once a small farmer fell into debt, it was very difficult for him to pay off his loan, to pay off his debts. By 600, many small farmers, maybe even most of them, had become permanent debtors. Sometimes small farmers would have to loan out a family member in order to, as partial payment on the debt. these family members would become what are known as debt slaves. That is, they would have to work for the aristocratic family on his farm until the debt was paid off. And of course, every time you remove a person from a small farm who contributes labor, it would be that much harder to pay the debt off. Sometimes the aristocrats would cheat the debtors, charging higher interest or forcing so many family members into slavery that the small farm would fold and the aristocrat would take over the land. As conditions worsened, the farmers appealed to the government for help. As things got worse and worse, small farmers went to the government, went to the council for help, but of course the council was dominated by the aristocratic families, and the aristocratic families had no interest in bringing about any change. After all, the system as it stood worked to their favor. The courts were dominated by the aristocrats, so a wronged debtor could not really find any relief at court either. Another problem was that the laws of the Athenians were mostly oral. That is, the laws of Athens were mostly passed down from aristocratic father to aristocratic son among the Eupatridae. Civil law was based on this oral tradition, and other kinds of law were based on the Dark Age tradition of blood feud. Criminal law, essentially, was based on the old Dark Age notion of blood feud. If somebody was wronged, it was up to his family to exact vengeance on the family that had wronged them. And since the Eupatridae were warrior aristocrats, they were pretty much down with blood feuds. They had no problem with blood feud at all. After all, they are the stronger warriors. Well, anger and frustration over these conditions may have erupted among small farmers in the 620s BC. As a result of this sort of pending civil war, an aristocrat named Draco came to power in Athens around 621 for about 2 years. He was, in essence, a tyrant. Remember, I talked about tyrants last time who come to power by unconstitutional means. Draco took over the whole government for a period of about 2 years. We're not entirely sure exactly what he achieved or even how he achieved power, but what we do know is he was given the task of creating a law code for the Athenians. And the other thing we know is that his law, which was written down for the first time, his laws were so severe, so harsh, that his name is forever associated with oppressive, draconian laws. Let me give you a few examples. Any debtor whose creditor was of a higher status, which would have been almost always the situation, any debtor whose creditor was of a higher status was forced into slavery to the creditor until the loan was passed. It was paid off. What had been a custom was now the law. The death sentence was applied even to very, very minor crimes, like petty theft, for instance. When Draco was asked why such minor crimes received the same death penalty as major crimes, Draco replied that he considered these lesser crimes to deserve death, and he couldn't think of any greater punishment for the more important crimes. Now, we also think, but are less sure, that under Draco's laws, most transgressions that had been left up to the family to avenge were placed under the authority of the Athenian courts. We think that one of the things that Draco tried to do was essentially abolish the idea of a blood feud. Well, although Draco's laws were codified so that aristocratic judges couldn't just make stuff up, his harsh laws were harder on the common people, harder on the common folks than they were on the eupatridae, than they were on the aristocrats. So we can assume that the tensions between the aristocratic class and the lower classes simply became worse, went from bad to worse as a result of Draco. By the beginning of the 500s BC, conditions in Athens were so bad that Attica was on the brink of a bloody civil war between the small farmers and the great aristocratic families. The aristocrats might have been impressive warriors, but if all of the small farmers rose up against them, then the common population would have been more than enough to wipe out the aristocrats. In 594 BC, the danger of revolution became so great that the aristocrats were forced to agree to reform the Athenian state. They appointed one man, giving him the office of sole archon, essentially an office of tyrant, and it was this one man's job for 1 year, he had 1 year to do it, to completely reform the Athenian state. Now, the man that was chosen for this position, who had the power to make any changes that he wanted, was a fellow by the name of Solon. Now, Solon was an aristocrat himself. But he was a poet, and he was very popular with the Athenian merchant class, many of whom, as I mentioned before, weren't really citizens. He placed the interests of the city above the interests of his class, the eupatridae, and he spent a year making reforms that he believed would weaken the aristocratic class and increase the prosperity and increase the order within the Athenian state. So now what we need to do is talk a little bit about the changes that he made. First off, he reformed the basis of participation in the Athenian government. Now remember, a little while ago I said that, the only people who could hold the archonship, the only people who could be elected to these official positions, annually elected positions, were the eupatridae, the members of the aristocratic class. What Solon did was he based the right to hold this position not on birth, but on wealth. In other words, he transformed the Athenian government system from an aristocracy, where people who are hereditary members of an aristocratic class, only they can hold office, to an oligarchy, a state in which representation in government, a state in which action in government is limited to folks based on their wealth. Now, office holding became dependent on wealth and not birth. This may not seem like much of an improvement to us, but it was. Now, any citizens could become an archon provided they made a lot of money first. The new requirement opened Athenian politics to the growing merchant community that lived in the city of Athens rather than in the countryside. Solon then gave citizenship to the wealthy city merchants, the metics. In the past, they had not been citizens, even though they were wealthy, even though they had a great deal of prestige in the city. They were not citizens. They came from somewhere else. They were resident foreigners. What we think that Solon did was he said, if your family has resided in Athens for a certain number of generations, maybe 2 generations, then I will make you an Athenian citizen. Now, this is very important because once these metics become citizens, they have enough money to hold office. They have enough money to be elected to an archonship, to become, over time, part of the Council of Athens. As merchants, their interests are very, very different from the interests of the Eupatridae, who are primarily rural agricultural planters. For the first time, the focus of Athenian politics began to move from the countryside to the city of Athens itself. Now, Solon also softened the laws of the Polis. Remember, Draco had had very, very harsh, well, there's the word, draconian policies, draconian laws, and Solon seems to have softened these laws a bit. He also had the laws of Athens published on large bronze tablets and placed in a public place on the Acropolis, so anybody could go to the Acropolis and see what the law said, see how the law was written. If you wanted to bring a suit against somebody, you yourself could go up to the Acropolis and read the laws of Athens and determine what law you would use to bring your suit. Anybody could find out what the law was whenever they wanted to. After Solon's time, these laws were available for a very long period of time. We think down to the 400s. Now, Solon attacked the problem of debt in a couple of ways. The first one is pretty simple. He simply abolished all debts. He abolished all debts. Any debts outstanding while Solon was the sole archon simply disappeared. If you owed somebody money, well, you didn't owe it anymore. You no longer owed it. If you were in slavery for a debt, since that debt no longer existed, then you would be free. You wouldn't have to be a slave anymore. Your debts were forgiven. Now, the second way that Solon reforms the economics of Athens is a little more complicated, so bear with me. I think this is probably his most important reform because it changes the nature of the Athenian economy and ultimately will make Athens a great economic powerhouse, but it's a little complicated. Here's what he did. Solon announced fairly early in his tenure that Attica had become so large and so dependent on grain to sustain its population that all the grain grown in Attica had to stay in Attica. He banned the export of grain to other places. He ordered that no grain could leave the Athenian state. Now, pretty much all the farmers in Athens, great or small, raised grain for their livelihood, mostly wheat, but some barley. Small farmers, aristocratic farmers, everybody basically devoted most of their crop to raising wheat. And in the past, The aristocrats, the only folks in Athens who raised enough to have a substantial surplus, the aristocrats would sell some of their grain, their surplus grain, outside of Athens. They would make a deal with a merchant trader, and the trader would buy their grain and take it somewhere else in the Aegean and sell it. Well, when Solon banned the exportation of grain, the great farmers had to figure out some other form of agriculture, some other way to make a good living on raising crops. And the best choice for Athens in terms of an alternative source of trade agricultural goods, the best choice for Attica was olives. So what Solon did was he manipulated the economy to force the aristocrats, if they wanted to continue to be wealthy on agricultural produce, to force the aristocrats to raise something other than wheat, and that something, the best possible food source or the best possible export item, was olive oil. Now, olive production has a couple of very important drawbacks in the context of this lecture. If you start from scratch to grow an olive grove, it's going to take nearly 25 years for your olive trees to mature enough for you to get a crop, a surplus crop that you can sell overseas. And of course, olives themselves don't carry a very good price. What you have to do is you have to turn those olives into olive oil. And that means that in preparation for this changeover from grain to olive oil, you're going to have to build olive presses and storage houses. It's going to require what we today would call a relatively substantial capital overlay. It's going to cost you money to get into the olive oil business. Now, all this is going to take 25 years before it bears fruit, if you'll pardon the pun, and a fair amount of capital in order to invest enough money or enough capital to get yourself ready to go into the olive oil business. What this means, the consequence of all this, is that aristocratic families will experience some pretty hard times for nearly a quarter of a century. They have to borrow wealth from the merchants to come up with the capital to switch from grain production to olive production, and then they have to borrow wheat from their neighbors who used to borrow wheat from them in order to feed themselves until their olive trees are mature enough to bring them profits. But once the aristocrats begin to produce and export oil, they become even more wealthy than ever before. The aristocrats were held back and humbled, dependent on the small farmers and merchants for their livelihood until they could make a full transition from grain farming to olive oil production. It also meant that after the aristocratic farmers produce olives, after the aristocrats have completely switched over their economy to the production of olives and olive oil, Athens will have a grain shortage. There won't be enough wheat and barley in Attica to feed the Athenian population. That means that traders, Athenian merchants, will be forced to buy grain and import it. And they will do that. They begin to trade olive oil and wine for wheat and barley that they buy all over the Aegean and even into the Black Sea. They create a market, selling olive oil mostly, purchasing wheat and barley in Asia Minor, in the Black Sea region, in Sicily, in North Africa. This prompts Athens to become, absolutely necessary for Athens to become, a great mercantile power in Greece, buying and selling goods, increasing trade, and of course making the merchants, the middlemen, who live in the city of Athens, wealthier and even more important, more powerful. Solon's grain reform, which was probably only meant to hold back the aristocrats for 25 or so years, would turn Athens into the most important merchant state in the Eastern Mediterranean. It would force Athens to become dependent on the wheat trade, and it would give the Athenians olive oil that they could use to barter all over the Mediterranean. Well, the main problem with Solon's reform, the main failing, if you will, of Solon's program, was that even though he had abolished debt, he hadn't really done much about the economic mechanisms that would cause it. The debt situation, in fact, would become greater and greater in the years after Solon's reforms. And this would lead to another civil war and the creation of a new, this time, non-constitutional tyranny that would last from 549 to 510 BC. You may remember that a tyrant is an illegal ruler who would seize control of the government of the city in times of unrest. In Athens, this tyrant was a man named Pisistratus, who gained the support of small farmers and probably small herdsmen in Athens, and took power, became the absolute leader, the tyrant of Athens, from 549 to 517 BC. When he died, his son took over as tyrant of Athens. His son was named Hippias, and he would continue to be tyrant until 510, when the Athenian people rose up and kicked him out. Well, like most tyrants, Pisistratus was himself a member of the aristocratic family, a member of an aristocratic family. He was a eupatrid. But his reforms were meant to reduce the power and status of the aristocratic class in order to reduce tensions within the state. In general, the reforms of Pisistratus were primarily aimed at changing the focus of the Athenian economy, changing the focus of Athenian society from the countryside to the city. Pisistratus's reforms made the city of Athens an even more powerful cosmopolitan center and the focus of Athenian life, even more so than Solon. So let's take a look at Pisistratus's, some of his reforms. And I have to say here we have a little bit of a problem because we're not entirely sure if these reforms were all made by Pisistratus or not. First off, he is credited with reforming the Athenian monetary system. It's possible, indeed probable, that for the first time cash money, silver and gold and copper coins, were introduced to the Athenian economy. Money is good for trade, and so it's very possible that Pisistratus saw that this would improve mercantile activity for Athens. He also created many new religious ceremonies to attract visitors and tourists to the city. In essence, Pisistratus turned Athens into a very important religious pilgrimage site, and people would come to Athens on religious pilgrimages from all over the Greek world. He also initiated an enormous building program, building temples and city buildings to beautify the city and to bring workers from the countryside into the city to work for Athens. These actions effectively relieved the economic pressures on Athens by making Athens a commercial and tourist city rather than an agricultural city. Pisistratus changed the focus of Athenian life from the countryside to the city, to urban life. The power in politics moved away from the aristocrats in the countryside and moved to the urban area of Athens. Now, this policy was disastrous ultimately for the tyranny. It ended economic unrest, and once economic unrest ended, nobody wanted a tyrant anymore. And in 510, the tyranny was abolished in Athens, and the old institutions of government were restored. The archons, the council, and the ecclesia, the assembly. The end of the tyranny paved the way for more changes in Athens, and the economic policies of Pisistratus strengthened the craftsmen and merchants of Athens who were unhappy with the older system that Solon had created. 2 years after the end of the tyranny in 508 BC, a reformer came into power in Athens, and his name was Cleisthenes, and he would push a series of reforms through the assembly that would make Athens more democratic and would expand the participation of government in Athens. First, he extended citizenship. Almost all of the non-Athenian, the resident aliens in Athens, that mostly, again, merchants and traders, almost all of them received citizenship under Cleisthenes, the ones that were left over when Solon expanded citizenship. Cleisthenes lowered the property requirements for holding the archonship, so that all but the very poorest classes of citizens were eligible to serve. But his most important reform was he changed the way that policy was made. He bypassed the old council of the Areopagus and created a new council called the Council of 500. Now, this council was an enormous council made up of folks who were chosen from various precincts in Attica, chosen by lot, chosen at random. The council was made up of 500 men, chosen annually by lot. They weren't elected, they were chosen at random, and the membership changed each year. The lots were drawn in such a way that the council would represent a sort of a geographical cross-section of Attica. So there were representatives from just about every class and every group in Attica. And they would make policies to send to the assembly. The assembly was expanded considerably because more people received citizenship. Remember, the assembly is made up of adult males who serve in the army. And we think during the predominance of Cleisthenes, for the first time, the Athenian assembly became a deliberative body. That is, not only could the assembly vote yes or no on policy, but the assembly members of the assembly could discuss policy. The city could argue and debate, the assembly could discuss and debate, and then finally vote on new policies. And this, of course, made Athens far more democratic. Athens was changed in essence by Cleisthenes from an oligarchy ruled by the wealthy to a democracy for the first time. Once democracy was established, Athens began to progress very rapidly as a result of her developing commerce. Between 500 and 479 BC, Athens emerged as a major power in the Greek world, and we need to consider this development now. The man responsible for the next important stage in the growth of Athenian power was a fellow by the name of Themistocles. Themistocles was a major Athenian leader off and on in the 480s and the 470s. Themistocles believed and understood that in order to make Athens a great sea power, it was necessary to have a strong navy. And under Themistocles' leadership, the Athenians built a navy of more than 200 triremes, which is the Greek warship, which made the Athenian fleet the largest fleet in the world. Now, as we'll see, in 490 BC, King Darius of Persia attempted to invade Attica and was defeated in the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC. This is called this particular battle. This defeat marks the end of the First Persian War. Themistocles realized the extent of the Persian threat, and he realized that the struggle with Persia had actually started earlier than 490. The struggle with Persia was certainly not over. In 483 BC, Themistocles sold a scheme to the Athenian assembly to expand the size of the Athenian navy from 100 triremes to 200 triremes, to double the size of the Athenian navy. Now, just before this, a large silver find, a silver strike, had been found in Attica. So the Athenian state, had an enormous amount of silver. The mines were taken over by the Athenian government. The Athenian state had an enormous supply of silver, an enormous supply of wealth. Themistocles went to the Athenian assembly and he said, I'd like to take this silver and give a certain amount of money to each member of the aristocratic class. And the aristocrat will be required to use that silver to build a trireme. And he will have, the head of the aristocratic family, will be the captain of the ship in time of war. The Athenian assembly bought the idea. They built another 100 brand new state-of-the-art triremes. A trireme was a ship with an extraordinarily well-trained rowing crew that could be used to ram enemy ships. Under the leadership of Themistocles, the Athenians created the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean. And Athens created this fleet just in the nick of time, because as we will see, Athens, indeed all of Greece, was about to experience a conflict that would threaten not only Greece itself, but the way of life of the Greeks and the future of democracy in the West. The Second Persian War. So, to sum up, from around 600 to the early 400s BC, Athens was transformed from an aristocracy dominated by a few aristocratic eupatridae families into a democracy. During the same time, the focus of Athenian life moved from the countryside, moved from agriculture to the city and trade and mercantile activities. Athens became a great merchant state whose merchant ships, supported with a formidable navy, traded goods and forged trade partners all over the eastern Mediterranean. As we will see, Athenian mercantile interests would soon run afoul of the 800-pound gorilla in the east after 500 BC, and we'll talk later about the war between the Greeks and the Persians.
Well, it's very interesting to learn about the different stages and developments in Athenian history as they went through their different stages. Of course, Athens was not born a democracy. They didn't just automatically become that way, but eventually grew into a democracy. So that was very interesting as well. Now, when we come back for our next lecture, we will focus on the city-state of Sparta. Sparta, nation of soldiers, very harsh upbringing for kids, and just the whole society was just focused on the military, very militaristic. You lived, you died for Sparta. You were born to serve Sparta. Women were put through gymnastics and strength exercises so that they could give birth to healthy babies for Sparta. The men were surrounded from an early age into surviving and military training, and just their whole being was the Spartan army. And so definitely a city-state to be reckoned with as well. Although, like I had mentioned before, not as culturally open and flourishing as Athens, of course, because, you know, with Athens you have a lot of the great Greek philosophers that will have come out of Athens. You don't see that in Sparta. You don't see that flowering of philosophy and thought and culture that you do in Athens. So it'll be, I can't wait until our next lecture on Sparta, the atypical polis. Until next time.